Alright, some of you have been really gagging for this one, so I may as well get it over with. Gotta complete the trifecta or something. So, mobile armors are what you get when you have something much bigger than a mobile suit, but still smaller than a battleship, though in some cases not by much. Mobile armors don't really have a design philosophy attached to them. In most cases, they're not even remotely humanoid, but they do mount much heavier weaponry than a typical mobile suit. At the point where they were introduced in the original series, it was mostly a platform for weird or hyper-specialized weaponry, though some of them really smack of, "Aw, damn it, we need a bad guy for this episode." Now, there is a backronym for the armor part of the mobile armor, but it's clearly some weird butt-covery retcon nonsense, so we're just not even going to look at that. That being said, the mobile armors all across the Gundam multiverse don't really have any specific requirements attached to them outside of internal logic, and so there's going to be some buck-fucking wild variance in size, armament, and capabilities. What gets classified as a mobile armor can be anything from the Mobius, which may as well be a jet fighter, to the Big Zam, which is more of a battleship, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But of course, as usual, the normal rules apply. This is my list with the stuff that I like personally, and if that doesn't jive with your internal list, sorry. Unfortunately, that means that I now have the difficult task of finding 10 of these things that I, actually like.
Several months later.
Alright, well, that proved impossible without dipping into Gundam Seed stuff, and that's a whole can of worms that I'm just not delving into. Anyway, to save me from having to look at Seed Destiny, I truncated this list to a top 5. The Opsilus and Big Zam are not on this list. The Noisiel is not on this list. Those things are more akin to mobile battleships than anything else. I don't really think they belong on a list of mobile armors. I'm just going to leave them off, and I think I'm going to come back to them later in a different video about super weapons. But here's the honorable mention. The Bound Dock was actually a top contender in here, but there's something in my brain that just does not accept this asymmetrical design of it. Plus, the weird dinosaur look is pretty cool, but I don't really think it's great for Gundam. Zeta was a show full of weird and wild designs, and I know this one is well beloved by the community. I just have more preferences for the way mobile armors and suits should look. Mostly I just like them to look like spacecraft with some extra bits or really big mobile suits. So, while the Bound Dock is interesting and quite whimsical, it's not really on my list of faves. So, sorry. Anyway, here's the list. Number 5. So here's an oddball mobile armor from an oddball show. The Godeel from Gundam X. Gundam X was a series that had its problems, many of them in fact, but it did have some good mech designs. Debatable on if the Godeel here counts among them, but I think it's charming in its own way. While most of the mobile armors on this list have the flight capability of a rocket-powered brick, the Godeel is more of a jet fighter than anything else, except for the itty-bitty little head on top. Now that might not sound terribly impressive for a series with weird and wild designs that fly across space with the greatest of ease. However, consider for a moment how much of a problem it is to get anything off the ground to stay off the ground when you're in an atmosphere, and suddenly the Godeel's immense and impressive maneuverability and agility become that much more impressive. Combine this with the typically bad luck that anything plane-shaped has fighting a mobile suit, and you might wonder why anyone would even try. Yet, the newly minted Godeel, operating in packs as one might expect a fighter wing to do, was able to critically damage the Gundam Airmaster, which was a relic of a bygone era of super tech. And sure, that particular Gundam came back around to take its revenge after a substantial upgrade, but if it had more production units behind it, the Godeel might have owned the skies of the after-war era.
This war will be won in space.
Spoil sport. Number 4. Something of the poster child for Zeonic desperation during the 1-Year War, where they were just strapping guns on anything with an engine and manipulators and hoping for the best. The Big Ro is big, it's green, and it's faster than a cop turning off his body camera. With 2 nuclear rocket engines and a peculiar profile, it could rotate a full 180 degrees in just over a second. Pulling those kinds of G's is not conducive to remaining a vertebrate, however, and it takes a special kind of pilot to not turn themselves into space-noid jello behind the sticks of this chonker. And because Minovsky particles make radar useless, it comes with a built-in scattering system to cloak its approach. Stealth is sort of a misnomer when it comes to giant robots, folks, but hey, here we are anyway. So once it does get to grips, if it doesn't immediately slam the target into pudding with its claws, it has a giant mega cannon to make short work of whatever it's pointed at. And to top it all off, who doesn't love missiles because it sports 2 quad tubes in its face region thing? But with all those skills and capabilities, its main weapon is also its biggest weakness, as the mega cannon is protected by a shield that has to open when it fires, and when you put a really good shot through it, it goes through a whole bunch of very important bits, including the cockpit. Oops. Well, better luck next time. Number 3. The Volvolo. Unsurprisingly, after the 1-year war, a lot of prototype and single-digit run mobile weapons were mothballed as their pilots decided to keep their heads down and went into jobs where they could be invisible. That's where Kelly Leisner went after things went south in a big way, ending up in a junkyard on the moon. While he was there, however, he was reconfiguring himself a mobile armor called the Volvolo. The Big Bro's big bro, the Volvolo was so heavily armored it could shrug off beam rifles, was studded with beam weaponry of all types, and properly armored claws. In addition, it featured plasma leaders, a weapon cribbed from the Adzam, to be used in space to short out electronics. A clear upgrade from the Big Bro, the Volvolo was more than a match for non-new type pilot Ko Araki's Gundam. If it had been put into full production earlier, like most mobile armors, it would have been a very different war. And of particular note is the fact that the Volvolo could be modified to be operated by a pilot without the use of both of their arms. That's not a feature initially in the unit, but Leisner had to make a few special modifications after his injury, and by all accounts, it didn't seem to have any diminished capacity. A nasty piece of work for an alright kind of guy. Number 2. Well, this is the most traditional thing on the list by a country mile, and it's kind of a gimme that it's even on here at all. But the Psycho Gundam is also the premier mobile armor, and people pay attention to it for a reason. Still, it lacks all the classic gimmicks and tricks that one might expect from a Universal Century mobile armor: integrated beam cannons, excessive size, beam barriers of some stripe. The Psycho Gundam is the pinnacle of flex from the Titans, being full of psi weaponry and being several times the size of a standard mobile suit. Its shape is also the kind of thing that will definitely give any Xeon remnants the chills, as it takes its look from the original Gundam. That's certainly no accident. Now, of course, the big thing about the Psycho Gundam is not about what a big beefy boy it is, and oh boy is it a big boy.
He's a big boy, he's the biggest boy, he's a big boy, he's the biggest boy.
But most importantly, for being the ride of a very ill-fated young lady. It's probably the second most important mobile armor in the entire franchise, if not for the next entrant, which is unquestionably the most important. Number 1. The Elmeth is a cute little scooty pop of a mobile armor and is probably the most distilled version of this type of weaponry in the Universal Century. I mean, sure, it's seafoam green and it looks kind of like Sosai X from Gatchaman, which will always net you points in my book, but it's also got everything one might expect from a new type use mobile armor. Basically, it's just bit central, and for a world where fighting occurs primarily within visual range, that makes it incredibly dangerous. When everyone else is using swords and shields, the ability to strike completely unseen is essentially a free win button. Unfortunately, because it lacks any close combat weaponry, or any limbs at all, it's still rather weak to anyone attacking it directly, and even with an escort, a very determined opponent could engage and destroy it. But when your pilots are primarily psychics, you'd think they would see that coming. Much like the Psycho Gundam, the importance of the Elmeth isn't in its armament or how many kills it gets, though it did darn well for itself, but in its unfortunate pilot. Forever demonstrating why you don't put prototypes on the battlefield, the Elmeth may have an impressive armament, but it seems to handle about as well as a drunken walrus. In spite of all that, I find the Elmeth to be the best mobile armor out there. One, because it's just this perfect ersatz distillation of what a mobile armor is, and for another thing, it's too important not to mention. And if I'm going to combine its importance to the story with how much I like it, which are two things that I really can't find myself separating, it may as well be number 1. So, hey, here's a little theory crafting from me if you'll indulge. Elmeth has some weird linguistic genetics with the word Emeth, a Hebrew word that was drawn on the head of the Golem of Prague to bring it to life. So if you strike the forehead and remove the first letter of that, the word Elmeth becomes simply met. And wouldn't you know it, when the Elmeth is taken out by the Gundam, where does it get hit? Right in the forehead. Now, there's no positive ID here, but hey, there have been thinner grounds for certain theories anyway, right? So that being said, I don't really have a huge soft spot for mobile armors, to be perfectly honest, but it's that thing that the heroes have to get past, sometimes just for the sake of making another episode, but also just for the sake of kind of proving their worth. They're the dragon to the Gundam's knight in shining armor. They're the thing that will stand in their way, that will be a turning point for that character. And we see that with Koaraki, we see that with Camille, and we see that with Amuro. Even to a lesser extent, with So, the Gundam Airmaster's pilot, though it's not quite as one-to-one. Well, I hope you enjoyed this walk down memory lane, and remember, if your list doesn't match up with mine, that's perfectly okay. Just admit that you're wrong. I'm kidding, of course. If yours are different, please let me know in the comments below, and be nice. That being said, this is Professor Otaku, the greatest American anime critic, signing off.